Well, today we're continuing our sermon series called Savior, looking at atonement theories. And if you have a Bible, I want to go ahead and invite you to turn to Romans chapter 5. We'll be getting there in a moment. There is a Bible in the front of you in the pew if you would like to use one of those. We're going to talk about something today called reconciliation atonement theory. So if you're a note taker, reconciliation, don't ask me how to spell it, because Word tells you how to spell it. It's amazing. But reconciliation atonement theory is what we're talking about today. How many people in your life do you disagree with? You don't have to show hands, it's okay. How many people do you dislike? Is there anybody in your life that you hate? I think this is a natural thing for us, that we often have these relationships, and a lot of people that we have the most strained relationships with in our lives were good relationships at one point, and then something happened, and that's why it makes it so painful. It's because it was really good, and then something happened that caused it to not be good anymore. When I was a senior in college, at Lindsey Wilson College, I was an RA, a resident assistant, and I had a boss who was my resident director, and one night, he sent us a text and said, "Hey, we're going to go out on patrol." Our job was to bust up parties. You love seeing us when we came into the room. But he said, "Let's go out on patrol." And we went on patrol. We left his apartment at 8 p.m. We got back at 3 o'clock in the morning. During that time, there was a lot of things that happened and a lot of decisions that were made by him that were not appropriate. One of them was we had to go bail out one of our other RAs who got put into a drunk tank that night. Not what you want to do as an RD. There was multiple parties that we went to address, but he kind of let things go because he was leaving anyway at the end of that year. It was kind of like the last 2 weeks of the year. And he was just kind of letting it all go. Well, that next morning after I woke up, and it was a college student, right? So about 10 a.m., I woke up, and I got an email from the dean of students that said, "Hey, I need a full report from you of what happened last night." Then I had to decide. I have my boss, who I really like this guy. He's a friend. But also, decisions were made that night that were not good. And my boss's boss, who I wanted to work for after college, was asking me for a report. So I wrote up the report. And I took responsibility for the actions that I was a part of that environment, but also identified the issues that were happening there before. Well, that was all compiled, and the RD got in trouble. And then the last stage of that, they were going to send an email for kind of a record keeping from the dean of students to the vice president of student affairs. In that email, they accidentally added my RD to the email. So he received the full report that I'd written. And he made some threatening comments on Facebook, talking about how he knew I was in our apartment and he was going to come up there and say something to me. He never did. But this person who I felt was a really, really good friend, one situation ruined that entire relationship. Now, since we have reconciled in some ways, but we're still not friends, we're more acquaintances. That relationship was never fully repaired. There's still a gap between us. I think it's happened to a lot of us. We have relationships that are good, and then something happens that causes that relationship to not be good anymore. The relationship is strained. And then we have to make a decision if we're going to reconcile with that person or not. So, we are built for relationships. From the Garden of Eden, we see that God walks with Adam and Eve in the garden, and he talks with them, and he spends his time with them. We're built for relationship, not just with God, but with each other. It's something we're built for, but sin entered into the world and broke that relationship. It strained it. It created a space, a gap, a chasm between us and God, and between us and each other. Remember, there was enmity between us. That gap that sin created was this chasm that could not be crossed by us. We couldn't do anything about it. So for us, reconciliation means that Christ, through his life, death, and resurrection, makes a bridge. Makes a bridge between us and God and us and each other. It enables us to live a life full in a full and free relationship with God and with each other. But it also tears down the walls that separate us and brings us together to be healed and to be healing agents in the world. That's what reconciliation does. Here's why that's important. Maybe you felt far from God. Maybe you feel far from God right now. I know a lot of Christians that feel far from God, so that's not a new experience. But we're all kind of wanting a relationship with God, even when we don't know it. You know, kids at Vacation Bible School, they hear the good news of Christ, and they want a relationship with this God that created everything. Young people will stare up at the night sky and think, how could all this have happened? And they're looking for something bigger than themselves. And adults, as all the challenges of life, the pains and the sorrows come, we seek, even if we don't believe in God, we seek relationship with something bigger than ourselves. That's naturally part of who we are. That's naturally a part of what we're built to do. We're missing this element. And that reconciliation with God is what Christ did. Sin makes it impossible for us to be in a relationship with God. So God then made a system. For God's chosen people, the Israelites, God created a system of sacrifice and of law and rules to try to help build a bridge that way. But it was one of those bridges that was kind of rickety. And it required a whole lot on the Israelites, on the human side. They had to live according to these rules and regulations. They had to give sacrifices the way they were supposed to give them in the right order, in the right way. This was all supposed to happen so that they could be in a relationship with God. But even that relationship was strained because how God spoke to them was limited. The relationship was only through certain terms. And in my mind, it's almost like visiting family that I've done before in prison, where there's this glass between us. And there's a phone. And yeah, you can talk on the phone with that person, but only at special times. And only if you've done all the right background check to get into the building. That's a relationship that the Israelites had with God. It was very much so strained. But then Christ came, and Christ decided to make a way in that because the system was corrupt. So Christ came so that it couldn't be corruptible, that his righteousness would make that happen. Now, this reconciliation atonement theory is one of the favorites of Paul. If you don't know who Paul is, we're going to talk about him a little bit more in a second, but he authored a lot of the New Testament, as we call it, the epistles of Paul, the letters to different churches. And he uses this imagery of reconciliation a lot because of who he is and how God was reconciling him. And this is what he says in the letter to the Romans chapter 5, we're going to verses 6 through 11. If you'll read that with me, this is what it says. You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person, some might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if, while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son, how much more? Say that with me. How much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? Thank you. Not only is this so, but we also boast in God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him, we have now received reconciliation. While we were God's enemies, Jesus made a way. I know a lot of Christians that struggle with this concept because they forget the fact that they did not perfect their way to Jesus. Let me say it to you. You did not perfect your way to Jesus. You did not earn Jesus. You did not check all the boxes to get Jesus. That's not what you did because you couldn't. Jesus found you when you were in rebellion, when you were a toddler throwing a temper tantrum about the rules of this world. When you had murderous intent, that's when God found you, and that's when God found me. And God came to us, not because of our perfection, but because he wanted to be present with us. But so often, we think that as we walk this life, if you're a Christian, maybe this is something that resonates with you. As we walk this life, and we mess up post-Jesus, that somehow that limits God's relationship with us. We realize that God entered in a relationship with us when we were at our absolute worst. There's nothing as a Christian that you could do to make God love you less, just like there's nothing that you can do as a non-Christian to make God love you less. Jesus came as we were enemies of him, enemies, active combatants against him. Christ came for us so that we can be in relationship. Christ came 99.9% to us while we were actively against God to reconcile our relationship. So if you're someone that's struggled with that, the fact that you don't feel close to God, know that God came to you even at your worst, and in particular at that moment. That perfection's not a requirement, presence is. So then the question for you is, how does the idea of Jesus building a bridge to you work in your mind? Imagine each of us is on an island, and God has built a bridge to you, but also God has built a bridge to each other. How does that understanding of the work of the cross resonate within you? The fact that there was this great chasm between you and God, between you and others, and then Christ made a way. And then the bigger question for that is, what if we allow Jesus to be the bridge back to God, and instead about worrying about acting right, we just worried about crossing the bridge that Christ has made, that comes with no real requirements except for confessing our belief in him and walking on the bridge. What if that was the focus? I want you to ponder that as we come to our time of prayer. Because I think it's important for us, before we go any farther, to recognize that Christ's work on the cross doesn't just save us from our sin. It brings us back to God. And it gives us bridges to each other that we would not have possible. Instead of yelling across the great chasm to one another, we now can live life up close. And not just with each other, but also with God.